Let's get real. Everyone acts like the 1960s was all flower power and Beatles mania. But lurking behind the psychedelic glow, Hollywood and beyond were pumping out horror movies so weird, so unsettling, they make today's blockbusters look like bedtime stories. Forgotten by most, these cinematic nightmares didn't just shock audiences, they crawled into their dreams and never left. So, are you ready to dig up the films that refuse to stay buried? Let's see how many you can handle before the credits roll. Homicidal 1961. If you thought the 1960s horror scene was all about vampires and haunted castles, Homicidal is here to yank the rug out from under your expectations and maybe toss you into a pit of razor blades for good measure. Brought to you by William Castle, the undisputed king of schlocky Hollywood gimmicks, this American shocker is equal parts murder mystery, psychological thriller, and carnival sideshow. Castle didn't just want you to watch a movie, he wanted you to feel like you were on a haunted roller coaster with no seatbelt. The story kicks off in a seemingly quiet California town where a mysterious, almost aggressively intense blonde named Emily appears out of nowhere. Within minutes, she's orchestrating a courthouse wedding with a complete stranger. And the next thing you know, there's a murder so cold-blooded and brutal it would make Hitchcock wince. What follows is a bizarre, twist-filled investigation with gender-bending secrets and a what-the-heck-is-going-on energy that never lets up. But here's the genius part. Castle didn't just load the script with curveballs. He built the movie around pure audience manipulation. When Homicidal premiered, theaters across America advertised a fright break, a 45-second countdown before the climax where audience members who were too scared could flee to the coward's corner in the lobby for a full refund. Castle even hired fake cowards to chicken out just to stir up hysteria. It was marketing mayhem, but it made the movie's reputation. And the film itself? Homicidal is genuinely unnerving, thanks to Jean Arless's unforgettable jittery performance and Castle's love for off-kilter camera angles, heavy shadows, and shocking violence. It's a Hollywood horror film that feels like it's daring you to look away, and then laughing when you can't. The reveal is one of the wildest left turns of the decade, a twist so memorable it inspired endless debate among horror nerds for years. So why does Homicidal still haunt those who find it? Because it's the kind of movie that takes your expectations, chops them into little pieces, and gleefully reassembles them into something you can't predict. In an era when horror was starting to play by the rules, William Castle made sure Homicidal broke everyone, and the genre was better for it. The Undertaker and His Pals, 1966. Ready for a horror flick that gleefully breaks every rule of good taste, storytelling, and frankly, sanity. Enter The Undertaker and His Pals, a twisted slice of exploitation cinema that is so gleefully unhinged, it almost feels like a dare. This isn't just a movie, it's an underground funhouse for horror fans who like their chills served up with a hefty side of gallows humor and absurdity. The plot? An Undertaker and his two motorcycle-riding pals hatch a scheme to drum up business for their struggling funeral parlor. How? By murdering random people around town, then selling the victims' body parts as mystery meat to a local greasy spoon diner. It's a plot so deranged you almost expect it to be urban legend, but no, it's all there. Playing out in gloriously lurid color, with a jazzy soundtrack and buckets of fake blood. What makes The Undertaker and His Pals so memorable isn't just its grindhouse plot, it's the attitude. Director T.L.P. Swicegood leans hard into the absurd, serving up visual gags, slapstick violence, and a kind of wink at the audience glee that feels like a precursor to both trauma movies and midnight comedy horror cult classics. Characters mug for the camera, scenes cut away for cheap laughs, and the movie's paper-thin plot is held together with little more than bravado and bad taste. But don't let the jokes fool you. There's a genuine sense of unease running through every frame. The violence, while cartoonish, is also surprisingly brutal at times. Victims are dispatched in increasingly creative and disgusting ways, with the camera lingering just long enough to make you squirm. It's a movie that dares you to laugh, and then makes you regret it 2 seconds later. Why does it still haunt viewers? Because The Undertaker and His Pals is one of those rare movies that captures the chaotic energy of 1960s exploitation horror. It's unpredictable, unsettling, and in its own dark way, weirdly charming. You might feel guilty for enjoying it, but you'll never forget the ride. Tormented, 1960. Is it possible for a B-movie ghost story to be genuinely creepy, stylish, and weirdly philosophical? Tormented makes a strong case. Directed by cult favorite Burt Roy Gordon, aka Mr. B.I.G., this indie-American shocker serves up supernatural revenge, jazzy surf noir vibes, and some truly striking imagery, despite a budget so tight it probably couldn't buy a round of drinks in Malibu. The premise is as classic as they come. Tom Stewart, a jazz pianist, is engaged to a wealthy woman on a picturesque island. All is going well until his jealous ex, Vi, turns up, demanding he break off the engagement. In a moment of panic, Tom lets Vi fall to her death from a lighthouse, and then, like a true horror protagonist, tries to cover it up. Bad move, Tom. Vi's ghost is not the forgiving type. What follows is a relentless campaign of spectral torment. Tom's life begins to unravel as Vi's vengeful spirit haunts him, appearing in photographs, reaching up from the sea, and turning his wedding plans into a waking nightmare. The movie doesn't rely on elaborate effects, but instead uses creative cinematography, eerie music, and a sense of psychological pressure that builds to a fever pitch. Tormented is a classic ghost story at heart, but it has a strangely modern edge. Tom isn't just battling a ghost, he's battling his own guilt, paranoia, and moral decay. Every time he tries to keep the secret buried, the haunting gets worse, and his sense of reality slips further away. There's a lesson here, delivered with just the right blend of supernatural spookiness and noir-inspired fatalism. This movie still lingers in the memories of viewers who find it, not because of shocking gore or outrageous monsters, but because it gets under your skin. It's a slow burn chiller that proves sometimes the scariest thing is the past refusing to stay dead, and your conscience making sure you never forget. Carnival of Souls, 1962. Ever stumble across a film so eerie, so offbeat, it feels like you've wandered into another dimension? That's Carnival of Souls, shot on a shoestring by industrial filmmaker Herc Harvey, who literally funded it by moonlighting as a driving instructor. This cult classic is the pure definition of atmospheric horror. No cheap jump scares, no buckets of blood, just creeping existential dread from frame one. It all kicks off with a drag race that goes spectacularly wrong, sending protagonist Mary Henry's car plunging off a bridge. She emerges from the river, somehow alive, but from that moment on, nothing about her world is quite right. Mary relocates to Utah and takes a job as a church organist, but she's haunted, literally, by visions of a pale, grinning ghoul played by Harvey himself and an abandoned amusement park that seems to call to her. The brilliance of Carnival of Souls is how it weaponizes isolation. Everything feels just a little off. People don't respond like they should. Music echoes from nowhere, and Mary drifts through life like a ghost in her own story. There's no gore, but the film is suffocatingly creepy, with stark black and white visuals and an organ score that practically writhes under your skin. At the time, mainstream critics shrugged it off as a cheap oddity, but decades later, filmmakers from David Lynch to George Romero would cite it as a direct influence. In fact, if you've ever watched Twin Peaks or Night of the Living Dead and felt a chill, you're hearing echoes of Carnival of Souls. The ending, no spoilers, is a masterclass in, wait, what just happened? Horror, guaranteed to stick with you long after the movie's over. It may not have made a box office splash in its day, but Carnival of Souls lives on precisely because it gets under your skin in ways no CGI monster ever could. This is the kind of horror that makes you question your own reality, and maybe check the rearview mirror a little more often on lonely highways. The Mask, 1961. Let's get trippy. The Mask isn't just forgotten, it's a cinematic oddity that feels like it crash-landed from another planet and somehow survived the cultural bonfire of the 60s. This Canadian cult classic, also known as Eyes of Hell, starts off like your standard low-budget horror about an ancient mask that drives people insane. But what sets it apart, and what still haunts viewers brave enough to track it down, is its wild, hallucinatory style and bizarre 3D sequences that break the fourth wall in ways nobody was ready for. Here's the setup. Dr. Alan Barnes, a psychiatrist, is given a mysterious tribal mask by a patient who promptly commits suicide. Against every ounce of common sense, Barnes puts the mask on, and boom, the movie erupts into full-on nightmare fuel. And here's where it gets wild. Whenever Barnes wears the mask, the film literally tells the audience, "Put the mask on now!" and plunges into surreal, psychedelic 3D horror. That's all swirling skeletons, melting faces, and screaming demons. Think about it. In 1961, people in theaters would slip on their cardboard 3D glasses and suddenly be bombarded with a barrage of images straight out of a fever dream. These sequences are as experimental as anything you'll see in art house cinema, yet they're stitched right into a grindhouse horror flick. There's nothing else like it. No jump scares, no gore, just pure, unfiltered weirdness. The rest of the film is drenched in paranoia, with Barnes slowly unraveling as the mask's visions become more seductive and destructive. The lines between reality and hallucination blur, and the film refuses to give the audience any safe ground. Critics at the time called it confusing and a little too intense for comfort, but that's exactly what gives The Mask its staying power. Why does this film still haunt? Because even now, there's nothing quite as disorienting as being ordered by the movie itself to put the mask on, and then being dragged headfirst into someone else's nightmare. If you think the 60s was all peace and love, The Mask is here to remind you there was plenty of darkness swirling just beneath the surface. The Sorcerers, 1967. Buckle up, because The Sorcerers is the kind of film that could only have come out of late 60s London, and it's every bit as twisted as the decade itself. Starring the immortal Boris Karloff, yes, Frankenstein's monster himself, in his later years, this British psychological horror takes the mad scientist trope and warps it into a tale of mind control, hedonism, and moral rot. Forget haunted houses. This movie haunts your conscience. Here's the pitch. Karloff plays Professor Montserrat, an aging hypnotist who's developed a machine that lets him and his wife Estelle experience someone else's sensations. They recruit a bored young man named Mike by Ian Ogilvy, and what starts as a scientific experiment quickly spirals into a joyride of sadism. Estelle, hungry for excitement, uses Mike's body to commit crimes, robbing, fighting, even killing, while the professor, horrified, realizes he's unleashed a monster he can't control. What makes The Sorcerers stick in your memory isn't just the premise, it's the way it captures the collapse of moral boundaries in swinging London. Karloff, frail but fierce, brings a tragic dignity to his role, while Catherine Lacey as Estelle is gleefully malevolent, practically licking her lips as she indulges every dark desire. The film's atmosphere is thick with unease, mixing the psychedelic energy of the era with a sense of creeping inevitable doom. Critics mostly ignored The Sorcerers on its release, dismissing it as another genre curiosity. But today, it feels like a warning about the dangers of technology, the temptations of voyeurism, and the corruption of innocence. A theme that only gets more relevant as the decades roll on. And let's be honest, the image of Karloff, haunted by what he's done, is not something you forget easily. If you're looking for horror that's more psychological than supernatural, and more disturbing for what it says about human nature than for what it shows, The Sorcerers is a gem that deserves to be resurrected. It's the kind of film that makes you wonder, how far would you go if you could feel someone else's pleasure and pain? Nightmare 1964. If you want your horror drenched in gothic dread, impossible shadows, and the constant feeling that you can't trust your own mind, Nightmare is your ticket to a sleepless night. This British thriller, produced by the legendary Hammer Films, rarely gets the same love as the studio's Dracula or Frankenstein outings, but make no mistake, it's a hidden masterclass in psychological terror. The story? Janet, a young girl traumatized by witnessing her mother murder her father, is now a teenager plagued by vivid, recurring nightmares. After years at boarding school, she's sent home to the same mansion where the original tragedy unfolded, in hopes that familiar surroundings might help her recover. Spoiler, they don't. Instead, Janet is tormented by ghostly visions, eerie singing, and a series of events that make her question her sanity at every turn. What sets Nightmare apart from your standard haunted house flick is how cleverly it manipulates both the audience and the protagonist. You're never quite sure what's real and what's Janet's crumbling mind playing tricks. Director Freddie Francis, a master of shadow and suggestion, uses every cinematic trick in the book to keep viewers off balance, creeping camera angles, sudden jolts of music, and lighting that swallows characters whole. Unlike most horror of its era, Nightmare has no monsters in the closet, just the monsters that live in your head. It's a slow burn, building an atmosphere of almost unbearable tension until you're second-guessing every single character on screen. And when the twist finally arrives, it's as gut-punching as anything Hammer ever produced. Why does it still haunt viewers? Because it gets under your skin without ever showing you what's hiding in the dark. It's psychological horror done right, intelligent, unsettling, and designed to linger long after the lights come up. In a decade known for cheap shocks and gimmicks, Nightmare proves that the scariest place of all might just be your own mind. The Dead One, 1961. You want a zombie movie that's weirder than anything Romero dreamed up? Step right up to The Dead One, also known as Blood of the Zombie, one of the most obscure, low-budget oddities in the history of horror. This is the sort of film you stumble across late at night, and then spend years wondering if you hallucinated the whole thing. Set in the eerie swamps of Louisiana, The Dead One takes classic voodoo legends and wraps them in early color film, giving everything a slightly lurid, feverish look. The story revolves around Monica Carlton, a scheming plantation heiress who dabbles in voodoo to raise the dead and protect her inheritance from a visiting cousin and his new wife. You think you've seen evil ants before? Monica takes the cake. She commands a lumbering zombie in a suit, stalking through Spanish moss and cypress trees, ready to dispatch anyone who stands in her way. There's a lo-fi, regional grit to The Dead One that makes it feel less like a Hollywood movie and more like some lost transmission from a cursed television station. The acting is uneven, the effects are crude, and the soundtrack is pure, swampy jazz. But that's exactly what gives it its charm. This is DIY horror at its rawest, the kind of movie that didn't just ignore the rules. It never even heard of them. What makes The Dead One stick in your mind isn't the scares, though there are a few genuinely creepy moments, but the weird atmosphere. There's a sense of isolation and otherworldliness to every scene, as if the film itself is under some kind of spell. It's one of the earliest color zombie films ever made, beating Night of the Living Dead to the punch by several years, and its Southern Gothic mood still feels unique. Most viewers missed it entirely on release, and even horror buffs sometimes overlook it. But for those who find it, The Dead One is a fascinating reminder that horror didn't need big studios or fancy effects to be unforgettable. All it needed was a swamp, a zombie, and a director bold enough to break the mold. Spiderbaby, 1967. You think you've seen dysfunctional families? Think again. Spiderbaby is the original Twisted family reunion. Equal parts horror, dark comedy, and gothic fairy tale, all marinated in the kind of low-budget weirdness only 1960s Hollywood could pull off. Directed by Jack Hill and starring a delightfully tragic Lon Chaney Jr. in his late-career comeback, this is one of those films that feels both way ahead of its time and completely unrepeatable. The Mary family is the definition of not your average neighbors. Thanks to a fictional hereditary syndrome, the Mary kids actually regress as they age, turning more childlike, violent, and yes, cannibalistic. Enter Chaney as Bruno, the family's loyal chauffeur and caretaker, desperately trying to keep the children's, let's call them hobbies, under wraps. Spoiler, it's not going well. When distant relatives arrive to claim the estate, what unfolds is a dinner party from hell, complete with murder, seduction, and some of the most unsettling sibling games ever captured on film. What sets Spiderbaby apart isn't just its bizarre premise, it's the tone. Hill plays the whole thing with a winking sense of humor and a streak of tragic melancholy, mixing slapstick with genuine scares. There are scenes so absurd you'll laugh out loud, and then, seconds later, you'll shiver at how quickly things turn dark. The film's low-budget roots only add to its surreal vibe. Crumbling mansions, dimly lit hallways, and a soundtrack that sounds like a haunted music box. Lon Chaney Jr. gives one of the most unexpectedly touching performances of his career, singing the haunting theme song and bringing real heart to his role as Bruno, a monster movie caretaker who's just as trapped as the children he protects. The supporting cast, including a young Sid Haig, throws themselves into the madness with gusto. Why does Spiderbaby still haunt the cult crowd? because it walks that razor-thin line between horror and comedy so well, and because it introduced the world to the psycho family trope decades before Texas Chainsaw ever picked up a chainsaw. This isn't just a weird old movie, it's the stuff midnight movie dreams and nightmares are made of. The Creeping Terror, 1964. Prepare yourself for the most hilariously unsettling creature feature to ever stumble across a movie screen. The Creeping Terror is infamous among horror fans, not for its polish, but for its sheer, jaw-dropping weirdness. This is the movie that makes you ask, was everyone just making it up as they went along? Spoiler alert, probably. Shot in rural California with a budget that wouldn't cover coffee for a Marvel crew, The Creeping Terror tells the story of an alien slug thing that lands near a small town and proceeds to devour everything in its path, including people, cars, and, at one point, a teenager's hot rod. The monster itself? Imagine a parade float made out of shag carpeting, operated by several guys who are clearly struggling not to trip over each other. It's both terrifying and, honestly, kind of adorable. But what makes this movie so haunting isn't just the creature, it's the way the entire film feels off-kilter. The soundtrack is mostly voiceover narration because the original audio track was lost. Scenes drag on just a little too long. Victims line up to be eaten with the resignation of people waiting for a bus. Yet, despite all this, or maybe because of it, the movie builds a surreal, hypnotic vibe that's hard to shake. And here's the twist. For all its technical failings, The Creeping Terror is genuinely unsettling in spots. The idea of a slow, unstoppable monster consuming everything in its path taps into a primal, existential dread that high-budget movies often miss. You start off laughing at the absurdity, but by the end, you're checking under your bed and reconsidering that shag carpet in your living room. Why does it still haunt viewers? Because The Creeping Terror is a beautiful disaster, a perfect storm of bad special effects, strange storytelling, and accidental genius. It's proof that you don't need money or star power to make something unforgettable. You just need a monster, a camera, and the guts to roll with whatever happens. So, after all these lost nightmares, how many did you survive? The 60s horror vault is deeper and darker than most movie fans ever realize, and these forgotten gems are proof that true terror never ages. It just lurks in the shadows, waiting to be rediscovered. Did we miss your favorite cult classic, or did one of these films crawl into your subconscious for the first time? Hit those comments, like, and subscribe, because some movies never let you go.